Satsuma Complex by Bob Mortimer. Yes, that Bob Mortimer is his first foray into the world of writing novels after his autobiography came out, I think last year or the year before. Oh, the year before, 2021. And it is perhaps not quite the novel I thought Bob Mortimer would write. If asked what sort of book would Bob Mortimer write, I would probably say something akin to Lucky Jim by Kingsley Amis, but more modern. Just a sort of bloke having the most unfortunate time of his life as wild things happen around him. And it sort of started as that. This follows Gary, whose surname I do not remember. He is 30, he is a legal assistant, and he seems to be characterised by the fact he is 5'7" and has a massive nose. I'm looking at Alex now because he is also 5'7" and has quite the schnoz.
It's not that big.
5'7" isn't that big, you're right, Alex. Anyway, it's about Gary, the legal assistant, who is not friendless, but he doesn't exactly have many meaningful connections in his life. Until one day he's at the pub with Brendan, who he sort of knows from work, and he meets this woman, and the only thing he knows about her is that she's reading a book called The Satsuma Complex. And that is how he intends to find her after they part ways and he hasn't learnt her name. So it starts off as this sort of slightly wacky rom-com, and then at some point during the book, I realised I was actually reading an episode of Line of Duty, because suddenly it was all about police corruption, which was a bit of a turn, but there we are. So that's the book. It is a first novel, and you do have to take it as that. But all things considered, it's not a bad attempt. Let's get into it. So, as you could probably guess, it is quite funny. It is very much Bob Mortimer's humour, so if you don't really like his style of humour, you're not going to like this book. It's a little bit random at times. It very much plays off of characteristics of other people, making light of situations, funny little one-liners and reactions to things. So if you like that humour, you probably enjoy this. If you don't like that humour, you won't. I like that humour, so I quite enjoyed how funny it is. Other than that, it actually is quite a good story. It's that it's a bit Line of Duty-ish. Not really, I've never seen Line of Duty, so I don't actually know. Alex is grimacing. But it does go into sort of police corruption and investigators and the police covering up evidence and hiding evidence and that sort of thing. So it's quite a serious plot line, really, underneath the crazy hijinks of the main characters. And I think actually Bob Mortimer does do it quite well. It is engaging, and you did want to find out what happened next. It really was, I hate the phrase page turner, but it was. I think I read it not in one sitting, but in maybe two. And also because you really like the characters. The characters are very likeable. It's a much more serious plot than you're anticipating, and then you really like all the characters. I did feel quite genuine peril at times in the novel, and I was concerned that some characters were not going to make it out alive, which is not what I was expecting. And really, looking back, I probably shouldn't have expected anyone to die, because it's not that sort of book. And yet, I was worried, so it definitely gets a tick for making you care about the characters and somehow having stakes, despite it not really being the book that you'd think would have stakes. It does go into some very serious themes as well. It sort of themes around loneliness and isolation and making connections and relationships with people, which again I wasn't really expecting. I thought it was just going to be a bit of fun, but actually no, it is about connection and loneliness, as seen through the main character Gary, who does not have many meaningful connections in his life. It's also explored actually through the idea of the Satsuma Complex, which is a book within the novel. This is the book that the girl that Gary's interested in is reading in the beginning. And the Satsuma Complex in the book is this sort of new book that's come out and everyone's talking about it, sort of fodder for book awards. And it's about loneliness and isolation. It's about what this book is about, but in a pretentious way. And you do read an excerpt from it in the book, which is quite funny, and how sort of Oh, it reminded me a little bit of, what's his face? Paulo Coelho, who did The Alchemist and things like that. That sort of fable-esque vibe, but it feels a little kind of obvious, and you can see why people would eat it up though. So I thought that was quite a fun addition. But yes, it does do the themes of isolation and connection very well. Again, it's surprising because it is a funny book. It's not a serious book, but I almost feel like because it is doing it in this light-hearted comedic way, it's almost more effective, in the same way that a lot of people who do suffer things like depression and loneliness often hide it with humour. Think about people like Robin Williams. I think it's an interesting choice of vessel, but it is an effective one. As with any book, it is not without its flaws, especially as it is a first novel. Not to say that first novels can't be spectacular, but usually, especially with celebrity writers, they do come with a couple of little issues. This one, yes, had some of those issues. Yes, it's funny, but sometimes that humour did at times take away from the plot. Not the seriousness of the themes, but I suppose plot moments where important bits are happening and you would have a few one-liners or sort of comedic reactions, and you sort of went, it doesn't really fit there because it's taking away from the meat of the story. So I feel like throughout it could have been toned down a little bit. It also had a problem with the dialogue. I don't think the dialogue was as good as it could have been. The description, that is fine, perfectly serviceable. But the dialogue, some of it didn't really sound very human, which surprised me because it's Bob Mortimer and he's, very dialogue heavy. That doesn't make any sense. The way he talks feels very naturalistic, so I was surprised that he seemed to struggle a little bit in this. And also that there were quite a lot of parts of the book where it was all dialogue. There were no dialogue tags or description between characters speaking. And I did at times lose who was talking because he employs this very specific type of humour that does bleed through a lot of the characters. So sometimes you just couldn't quite remember who was talking because they have a similar way of talking. Most obvious example of this is when Gary is talking to a squirrel, which happens quite a lot. I quite like the squirrel. That's quite a fun little detail, this squirrel that lives outside his apartment. It's like Christopher and Sven from Frozen. But instead of an animated mountain man raised by rocks and his best friend the reindeer, it's a depressed and lonely legal assistant and a wild flea-ridden squirrel in a children's playground completely devoid of children, which is slightly less charming. Every time he sees the squirrel seems to pause and he'll talk to the squirrel about his problems and the squirrel talks back, but he's filling in the squirrel's voice. So obviously in those bits of dialogue, it's laid out as if it's two different people talking, but it's all Gary. So of course the voice is going to be the same because it's the same person talking. But you did lose it a little bit. I was also disappointed with the lack of interesting names. Everyone's got normal names in this. It's Gary, there's Grace, there's Brendan, there's Emily, there's a Wayne's dad, whose name I can't remember. They're sort of very typical names, which is a strange complaint to make. But if you listen to Bob Mortimer's insane stories on Would I Lie to You, most of which are true for some strange reason, he has great names. Like
Staver and Bagger. Neil Overall, Jerry Dungaree's son. And Gary Cheeseman would be there. Sniper's Dream, they used to call him. And Bill Whittlingham. Or Mickey's, Mickey the Drink. Billy the Pigeon. Well, we called him Mavis. We met Harry Harriman and Steve. Steve Seaverman. Steve, by the way. I believe he was called Ron Waffle. And the other ace reporter on the Gazette was John Caramel.
I mean, after Caramel and Waffle, the journalists, I was a little disappointed that we had Gary and Grace and Brendan, but hey-ho. Also, a tiny little thing, which is really stupid, but there we are. Gary and Grace's names are far too similar on the page. They both are very short and have G-A-R or G-R-A as the opening to each name, and it's a tiny thing, but one of the things I was told when doing creative writing at uni was don't give two different characters very similar names because it just confuses the reader, because the human brain just reads things really quickly. Especially if you're like me and you just speed read everything. And sometimes the brain will just come to conclusions. Yes, on one hand, the reader should just read the book properly. But on the other hand, it's a tiny thing. Just change your character's name, because every single person does it. It's not just some people. That is just how the human brain works. Oh, I did also wish that the Satsuma Complex, the book itself, featured a little bit more in the Satsuma Complex, the book, because it's built up, it's been quite important, as it's the only thing that Gary has to find the woman, Emily. He finds her quite easily without really the book helping, so that felt a little bit misleading. And it doesn't really feature that much throughout, which I was disappointed by, because I love me a MacGuffin. I love me any important props, and it felt like an important prop, and it was a book. And it's described as looking like this. Like it's a dark blue book with a massive Satsuma and a squirrel on the front. And I was like, that's hilarious. And then it didn't seem to feature or be that important. So I was a little bit disappointed by that. I would have liked to have featured a little bit more, but maybe that's the point. I don't know. Also, there was no duckling in this. There should have been a duckling. That'll make sense if you read it. You should read it and then you'll understand the duckling. In conclusion, I enjoyed this book. It feels very first novel-ish with the dialogue issues and the naming things and the humour being a little bit the same throughout. But that is all stuff that I would expect in a first novel. So make of that what you will. It's not necessarily a negative thing. Well, it is, but it's not that negative. I don't think it should put people off, and I'm confident that in 10 years, Bob Mortimer will come back and look at this and think, if I'd written that today, that's how I'd have written it. That was a really bad impression of Bob Mortimer. This is why I'm not an impressionist. So yeah, still places to improve, but on the whole, it's a pretty fun novel if you like Bob Mortimer's style of humour. If you do not, and I cannot emphasize this enough, if you don't like his humour, you probably will not like this book. So don't be going out and complaining. That is all we have time for today, which is a good thing because I need to go to bed. Good night. And Merry Christmas. Not quite, it's not Christmas yet.